This week, we're going to start a series on the book of Ruth. And so if you've got your Bible, why don't you do me a favor? Go ahead and turn there with me. We're going to be in Ruth chapter 1 today. Ruth chapter 1. If you're not familiar with where Ruth is, that's an awkward statement. If you're not familiar, and I know it's a small book, and if you're anything like me, I'll just be honest. Sometimes when it comes to the smaller books of the Bible, you ever have trouble finding it because it's only a couple pages and you keep skipping over it? Does anybody else do that, or is that, okay, cool. Especially if you've got like the really thin pages, you know what I mean? Anyway, here's an easy way to help you find it. It's the 8th book of the Bible. You've got Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth. It's right after Judges, and I'm going to teach you a really easy way to remember that here in just a minute. So again, we're going to be in Ruth chapter 1, and while you're turning there, really quickly, the reason I wanted to look at Ruth is because Ruth is a story of hopelessness. I wonder how many of us today, at some point over the last, let's say, 8-ish months or so, hypothetically off the top of my head, how many of us have been dealing with like these reoccurring feelings of hopelessness? Anybody here? Because I know I have. We have been living in a world that's gone through a whole lot, whether it's the pandemic, whether it's the lockdown, the quarantines, the restrictions, having to wear a mask everywhere. Let's be honest, that gets frustrating, especially if you're doing any sort of physical activity. There's the social justice issues. There's the racism that we've seen in our culture and the violence. We're dealing with economic issues. We're dealing with the loss of jobs. There's a presidential election going on and all the drama around that. And then, as if that wasn't enough, we've also got how all of those things begin to affect our relationships, right? It affects our families, our relationship maybe with your parents or with your kids or even with your spouse or your friends. That all of these things are just working together. And if you're anything like me, there have been these times over and over and over when I look at something or something that's happening in the world and I just want to say, God, like this just feels hopeless, doesn't it? Anybody been there? So I know I have. And this is why I wanted to look at the story of Ruth. Because Ruth is a story about finding hope, even in the most hopeless of times, the most hopeless of situations. So if you got your Bible, we're diving in. Ruth chapter 1, beginning in verse 1, here we go. It says this, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. I want to stop there really quick. This first half verse is actually very, very important to understand what in the world's happening here. Because this is the setting of the story. You see, this story takes place during the period of the Judges. This is, by the way, why it's easy to remember that Ruth comes right after Judges, because this story takes place in the midst of that story. Are you with me? So this story takes place in the period of the Judges, and if you're not familiar, the period of the Judges is this very dark time in Israel's history, where they make all the wrong choices, and things are just constantly going from bad to worse, that things are slowly spiraling out of control, which explains why there's a famine in the land. You see, they are experiencing the judgment of God. Sometimes in Israel, things get so bad, so out of control, that God has to do something drastic, like send a famine, as a way of getting their attention, snapping them, bringing them back, so that they can realign their hearts and come back to Him. And so again, they're experiencing this famine because they're experiencing the judgment of God. That's what's going on here. Notice what happens next. Again, time of the Judges, famine in the land. It says this, and the man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn or live in the country of Moab. He and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech. That's, by the way, is super fun to say. Say it, Elimelech. Isn't it fun? I thought so. Elimelech, the name of his wife was Naomi, and the name of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilon. They were Ephraimites from Bethlehem in Judah, and they went into the country of Moab and remained there. So, there's a drought in the land. And remember, they're living in a culture of limited resources, right? We've talked about this before. If you don't have, like, rain, you can't grow crops. If you don't have food, you're in really big trouble. And so there's a famine in the land. And so this guy decides he's going to uproot his family and move to the land of Moab, which raises the question, why did they decide to go to Moab? What's interesting is that Moab is only about 15 miles away from Bethlehem. And in fact, from certain hillsides in Bethlehem, you can actually look out and see the valleys or the plains of Moab. And so this is probably one of those grass is greener on the other side scenarios. Are you with me? Like, I'm looking around, everything is dead here, but it looks green over there, so why not go, right? And that's not weird to us, because we live in a world where we do this all the time. We move to where the jobs are. We have no problem uprooting our family in order to get work. And the same sort of thing is happening here. There's no food here. There's clearly food there. I'll tell you what, let's go over there. I mean, that just makes sense, right? But here's the thing. Yes, that's common in our world, but in their world, this is actually a really, really, really big deal, because there's all kinds of implications about moving to the land of Moab. The first one is one that I've talked about all the time. And again, if you've been with us before, if you've been watching with us before, you should know this one. The two most important things in the ancient world were what? Do you remember? Land and family, right? Land and family. Your land was your provision. Your family was your protection. In the ancient world, you needed these two things to survive. To move to the land of Moab, you would be giving up both your land and your family. This is a very big deal. And in fact, this story, as we go through it over the next couple of weeks, you are going to begin to understand why this is such a serious thing in the ancient world. And so they were leaving their land and their family. But there's another layer to this. You see, one of the things that they believed is that the land of Israel was more than just the land where they lived. The land of Israel for them, they saw as the actual dwelling place of God. That's where God lived. And because of that, that's where the presence of God was. The presence of God was here in this land, which means to leave the land was to leave the very presence of God itself. This is an ancient way of saying they left their faith. Are you with me? This is a very, 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 very big deal. But again, there's another layer to this story. They decide to not only leave the presence of God, but they go to the land of Moab. The Moabites are the enemies of Israel. And in fact, I want you to notice this verse out of Deuteronomy 23:3. You don't have to turn there, but if you're a note taker or if you like to jot notes in the corner of your Bible, this is one you want to write down. Deuteronomy 23:3. And in fact, every time in the story of Ruth, you see the word Moab or Moabite, I want you to remember this verse. This verse is essential. This verse is like the background program of this story. You know what I mean by that? Like, it's the thing that's constantly running behind the scenes. Everybody's thinking this throughout the story. I want you to notice what God says in Deuteronomy 23:3 about the Moabites. Check this out. It says, "No Ammonite or Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. None of them may enter the assembly of the Lord forever." Moabites were like the sworn enemies of Israel. And so these guys decide to leave everything, leave the presence of God, and go there. Are you with me? This is a very serious decision. Look at what happens next. Verse 3. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. Now, for Naomi, this is a bad situation. Because, remember, they're living in a male-dominated culture where women were completely dependent on the men in their life to provide for them and to take care of them. Men were the only ones who were allowed to work. Men were the only ones who were allowed to buy and sell land, which, of course, is a very big deal. She was completely dependent. This is a bad situation, but it's not hopeless, because she still has her 2 sons, Machlon and Chilion. But look at verse 4. It says this, "These," talking about the sons, took Moabite wives. The name of one of them was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth. And so they lived there about 10 years. Notice this, they marry Moabite women, and this tells us that they have no plan of going back. They are Moabites living in a Moabite land. And then it says this in verse 5. Actually, second half of verse 4, sorry. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. I want to stop right here. This, for Naomi, is a hopeless situation. She has no land. She has no family. And to make matters worse about that, by the way, understand when Elimelech made the decision to uproot his family, that was his decision. She wouldn't have had a say in that. She has no land. She has no family. She had no say in the decision. She has no husband. She has no sons. She has no way to take care of herself whatsoever. This, for Naomi, is a hopeless situation. And in fact, I've heard some scholars argue that in the entire Bible, this moment is the most hopeless situation that you will see. Now, that may be debatable, but I want you to understand how bad this whole situation is. That Naomi is stuck, which raises a question. What do you do when there's absolutely nothing that you can do? Ever been there? You ever been stuck like that? I want you to notice the way that Naomi responds. I think this is absolutely huge. By the way, it sounds simple, but you ever notice how simple things aren't always easy? Look at this. Verse 6, then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab. For she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. She decides to go back. And again, the picture here is that she is returning not just to the land, but to God. And in fact, the word here for return is the Hebrew word shuv. Shuv is a word that literally means repent or to turn back. See, in life, there's going to be hopeless times. Situations that are so big, so overwhelming that you're going to be like, I don't know what to do. And in fact, there are going to be times when you're going to be like, there's nothing I can do. Sometimes, all you can do is go back to God. Sometimes, all you can do is return to God. And I want you to notice that Naomi has this ability of returning to God, even though she's mad at him. As we go through this story, one of the things that you're going to see is that Naomi isn't happy with God. And she doesn't even pull her punches, right? How many of us get mad at God, but we know we're not supposed to be mad at God because he's God? Do you ever do that? And so you do the passive-aggressive anger at God thing? Nobody? Okay, because I do that. Come on now. Right? Like, we all do that, but Naomi doesn't do that. Like, she doesn't pull her punches here. She's mad, but check this out. You can be mad at God and return to God at the same time. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. Because sometimes, and oftentimes, when we're the maddest at God, those are the times that we need to return to God the most. And so she decides to return to God. Verse 7. So she set out from that place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law. And they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. Verse 8. But Naomi said to her daughters-in-law, 2 daughters-in-law, go return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you, in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And then notice verse 10. And they said to her, both of them, no, we will return with you to the people. So Naomi tries to push them away. Says, go back to your families. And both of them, not just Ruth, but both of them say no. And I want you to understand something here. The reason that they want to stick with Naomi is to what they would call honor the dead. You see, one of the things that they believed, well, a couple of things. First of all, one of the biggest tragedies in the ancient world was for a family name to completely die out, and that's what's at risk here. And so one of the reasons they want to stay with Naomi is that they are hoping that at some point she's going to have another son, that they will be able to then marry that son, because that's the culture of their world, and be able to provide an heir in order to keep the family name going on. In the Moabite world, here's the other layer. In the Moabite world, they believed that there was an afterlife connection between connecting by continuing the family line. Meaning if the family line died out, the person's existence in the afterlife, they believed, died out as well. And so they were willing to go with her. They were willing to stick with her because they loved their husbands that much. That's part of what it's talking about when it talks about honoring the dead. And so they both say, no, we're going with you. But notice the way that Naomi responds. Verse 11, Naomi said, turn back, my daughters. Why would you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go on your way, for I am too old to have a husband. And if I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait until they were grown? Would you refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Again, we see just how mad she is at God. She is just filled with this bitterness. But I want you to notice what she's saying here. She's saying, look, I appreciate the gesture, but let's be honest. Let's be practical. I'm not married. I'm clearly not pregnant. Would you really, really, really be willing to wait until I got married and had a child? Hopefully that child is a boy, so that you would eventually wait until he's old enough to be married and then marry him in hopes of carrying on the family line. Like, practically speaking, that doesn't make sense, does it? I mean, let's just be honest. And that's what Naomi's doing here. By the way, God ever call you to do something impractical? Did you ever read something or felt like God was telling you to do something and you're like, yeah, but that just doesn't make sense. Like, that worked for the Bible, but that doesn't work for us. That's where Naomi's at. That just doesn't make sense. That's not practical. More than that, I guarantee you part of what's going through Naomi's head is Deuteronomy 23:3. She knows if they come back, those women will be treated as outsiders, and she loves and cares for them too much. And so she tries to push them away. Verse 14. Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, which is a way of saying goodbye. But notice what it says. Ruth clung to her. If you love to underline your Bible, underline, circle, highlight, do whatever to the word clung, because that word is very, very good. The word clung here is a word that we see in Genesis 2:24 when it talks about the man and the woman coming together and being one. That is that word. This is a great picture of Ruth just clinging on to her mother-in-law, that she isn't going anywhere. And then it says this, verse 15. This is Naomi speaking. She says, see, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods to return after your sister-in-law. But notice how Ruth responds. But Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you. The word urge here literally means injure me, because sometimes words hurt, don't they? Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. And then she says this, for where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. And when Naomi heard this, saw this, that she was determined to go with her, she said, no more. I love it, because Naomi sees the determination of Ruth, and she says, all right, here we go. Notice, though, what Ruth is saying here in this whole thing when she says, where you go, I will go. That is what's known as a pledge or an oath of loyalty. Ruth is basically giving an oath, binding herself to Naomi. This is why Naomi doesn't fight her, because she's given an oath, and an oath cannot be broken. Ruth is dead set, determined to stick with her no matter what. More than that, this would have been a conversion experience in the ancient world. This part where she says, your God will be my God. She's saying, look, as I follow you, I'm going to follow your God as well. And so she's dedicating herself not just to Naomi, but to Yahweh. Then it says this, verse 19. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred up because of them. And the women said, because small town. And the women said, is this Naomi? I mean, seriously, think about that for a minute. It's been at least 10 years since Naomi left. 10 years ago, she left, and probably more than that. But at least 10 years ago, she left with a husband and 2 sons. She comes back over a decade later, no husband, no sons, and a Moabite woman. What's happened here? I feel like there's a story. I want to know the story, right? That's what they're thinking. But notice what she says next. Verse 20. She said to them, do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara. By the way, there's a wordplay going on here. Naomi means pleasant. Mara means bitter. Don't you dare call me pleasant, because I am bitter. Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. For I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought this calamity upon me? Let me ask you, in those last 2 verses, did you notice the amount of times that Naomi said either me, my, or I? Did you notice that? 8 times. 8 times in those 2 verses, Naomi uses this self-centered language. And I think this is important for us to understand, because when we are hurt, have you ever noticed that whenever we get hurt, we get very self-centered? You ever have a bad day, but it didn't start off as a bad day? But it was like you started your day and then something happened, like you turned on the Keurig without putting the cup under it? Not saying. But those of you with ADD know what I'm talking about. I'm just saying. And then something else happened, and then somebody cut you off on the way to work, and then you hit that red light, and at that point, I know it's just a red light, but it's more than just a red light, isn't it? And then you go to work, and then this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and then you hit another red light, can you believe it, on the way home? And then at that point, you're just so focused on the things that are going wrong. Obviously, God is against me. Obviously, God is working against me. That when we are hurt, we get very, very, very self-centered and self-focused. And here's the danger here. Because for a lot of us, this is where we're at in 2020, isn't it? And in fact, I'll be honest, how many of us have been following with this whole 2020 apocalypse bingo idea? You know what I mean? We look at everything, and obviously it's a sign of the end times. Obviously the world's coming to an end. Remember murder hornets? How worked up we got about murder hornets. I never saw them. Did you? I don't know. People online, I know there's lots of people, different places. Maybe we just didn't get them in Omaha. I don't know. Let me know if you got one. I never saw one. But we got worked up about murder hornets. Why? Because we were so sensitive. Because so much had happened at that point. Every month there was something. There was wildfires and lockdown and quarantine and, obviously murder hornets were a thing. Except they weren't really a thing. We just turned them into a thing because we were being very, very, very focused on ourselves and what could go wrong. And I think that's part of what's happening here. When you get hurt, you get very self-centered. And this is why this is such a problem. And if you hear anything I have to say, I just want you to hear this. When you get this self-focused on the hurt and the pain, it's going to blind you, absolutely blind you from all the things that God is doing around us. Because while you are stepping back and focusing on the hurt and the pain, all the while we're seeing glimmers of hope of God moving all around us. And if we could just look up from our pain and our hurt and look around, we would begin to see the signs that God is up to something. And in fact, we've already seen one in this story. Notice the number 8 that I referred to earlier. 8 times in the Hebrew numerology. So, in Hebrew thought, numbers are more than numbers, right? For example, the number 7. If I say number 7, you're like, oh, like that's a thing, right? Or if I say 40, you understand, like there's something special about that number. Or if I say the number 666, you're like, ah, right? I mean, it's October, we can do that. Numbers in Hebrew thought are always deeper. There's always this deeper symbolic thing behind them, and the number 8 is absolutely huge because the number 8 is all about newness. It is a new day, a new creation, a new beginning. This goes back to the 7 days of creation. On the 8th day, it began. On the 8th day, there was a new beginning. By the way, John, in the Gospel of John, picks up on this. You guys are going to love this. Did you know that there are 7 miracles of Jesus in the book of John before the crucifixion? The resurrection is the 8th miracle because this is a new day. This is a new beginning, and he is making all things new. 8 is about hope and expectation, and we see that in the very next verse. I love this. You guys are going to love it. Verse 22. So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, again, every time you hear Moabite, remember that verse. Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. If you've got your Bible, underline barley harvest. That is a game changer, and I know what you're thinking. Really? Like, what's the big deal with the barley harvest? I mean, cool, but it's a harvest, right? Okay, so check this out. The barley harvest began what is known as the season of first fruits. The season of first fruits is a time when they would remember the provision of God. Come on, somebody. Please tell me you're seeing this. It's all about God providing. And so what you would do is you would take the first of your crops, you would give it over to God as a way of saying, okay, God, I am giving this to you. And if this is all I have for the year, I am going to trust you. That you are going to take care of me, that you are going to provide for me, even in the most hopeless of situations. First fruits is all about expectation. And we see that with the barley harvest. Because the barley harvest itself actually points to something better. You see, the barley harvest, it wasn't really exciting. It was considered to be the poor man's bread. It wasn't, like nobody really got excited about the barley harvest. But the beginning of the barley harvest began people looking forward to and counting to the wheat harvest. And the wheat harvest was what they were really excited about. It was a time of hope and expectation. The wheat harvest reminds us that something better is right around the corner. And Naomi can't see it because she is so focused on the hurt. See, I wonder how many of us are here today and we're in the same boat. How many of us are here, and I'll just be real, we're going through a lot of pain, aren't we? Whether, again, it's the pandemic, it's being sick, or just the fear of being sick. I know for so many of you, you've got some underlying health issues, and you're really concerned about what's going to happen. And so there's this level of fear and worry. For some of you, you've dealt with the loss of a job, or you're worried about the loss of a job. For some of you, you've dealt with some financial restrictions because of all this. The loss of a job and how that's affected your finances. For some of you, it's affected our relationships. I wonder how many of us have been so focused on the pain over the last 8-ish months or so that we forgot to look up. That we forgot to look around at the glimmers of hope, the fingerprints of God's movement all around us. Because I'm telling you, He's up to something. He's moving. And if we can just pull ourselves away from the constant news stream of political updates, I'm not saying, I'm just saying. I wonder how many of us, even when the world tells us everything is coming to an end, that this is the time to panic, how many of us would look up and see hope? How many of us would look up and see expectation? How many of us would see that God is on the edge of doing something and He's inviting us to join in, but we've got to begin by returning to Him and looking up in the pain. So here's your challenge this week. I don't know what the thing is for you. I don't know if it's somebody that you always push back against, or maybe for you it is just like being glued to our. I feel like this is the thing right now, being glued to our phones with a constant stream of news of what's happening around the world, and especially with the political world. My challenge for you is to try to put aside the hurt, put aside the pain, turn off the phone. Start to intentionally look for the ways that God's working, because I'm telling you, He's up to something. I'm telling you, He's inviting us to be a part of something big. But we've got to begin by looking up. Can you see it? Can you see the things that God is doing all around us? Let me pray for us. God, again, thank you for today, for the chance that we have to come together, whether it's physically or virtually. God, we are blessed beyond reason. God, give us eyes to see. Eyes to see the ways that you're moving around us, even in the most hopeless of times. Give us the courage to look beyond the hurt, to look beyond the pain, and to join in the thing that you're doing. God, thank you for today, for loving us so much that you were willing to give it all up, to die on a cross, so that we